side that she influenced me on. So I just want to say her name out loud. And I think the very first thing that I want to share about is my own journey, why this became so important to me, and why I feel like I want you to really think about it and pay attention to it, and if you can, work with it, because I really do believe that this is the bottom line, that shame and shaming is why couples can't do the thing that they're asking you to help them with. And my belief is that if we stay with the vertical process long enough with any person or any couple, this is what will start to get flushed out, is their shame and their shaming parts and their shamed parts that are getting in the way from allowing them to have the relationships that they want. And I have always given lip service to shame. I mean, I'm a therapist, and I read John Bradshaw, and I believed him, right? But I gave lip service to it because I didn't really want to pay attention to my own, even though I knew that it was lurking in there. And a few years ago, I got some feedback from a friend and a colleague that came at me like a freight train. There was no question about how that person was feeling toward me, and confronted me about some things that I was doing that I was unconscious about. And at the same time, interestingly enough, as the universe would have it, my sister began giving me some similar feedback about something that I do in our family of origin. So it was kind of like, you know, it was just kind of like two freight trains whacking me at the same time. And the feeling, I mean, I can even feel it right now as I'm starting to talk to you. And I think I'm feeling vulnerable because of your vulnerable sharing. So it just brought me to my knees. And I thought, I am going to have to deal with this, because the feeling was so horrible that I was so bad. And that I was so bad, and I didn't even know how bad I was. That, and two people that I really cared about, what my part heard, two people that I really cared about were telling me how bad I was. So I got myself off my knees, and I went back to my IFS therapist, and I said, I got to get with this. You know, I have to get with this, because the feeling of being or feeling so shamed, and then shaming myself because that part believed the message, you know, was almost intolerable for me. And so I started that work. And at the same time, the bright light about that is that I was working, Martha was editing a chapter that I was writing for New Dimensions. And that's when we began kind of our camaraderie on, it's all about shame and there's nothing else, right? So I started learning inside and I started learning outside. And the very first thing that I had to do is I had to learn to love the shaming parts of me that were circling my exiles. And that's how it showed up inside, is those protectors that said never again about shame. What came up for me in my work was all of these armored guards that were circling around the parts of me that had so much shame and came out of my childhood feeling so less than. I couldn't really get to those exiles until I faced that not only did I shame myself, but those protectors took it out. So, you know, it was an outside, inside, outside, inside, outside, inside, and that was the journey for me of really healing these shamed parts of myself, is to recognize those loyal soldiers who were doing damage to me and to other people, and to own that. What I do to myself, I do to others as well, even though I don't want to acknowledge that. And that caretaking and codependency and all of those are protectors against shame, and they are actually hurtful to other people. So I've gotten behind this idea of working with shame in relationship and helping therapists start to recognize it and be able to name it and work with it with a lot of courage. What I'm hoping for today, this morning, that your takeaways you'll take away a working definition of shame and shaming. And one of the other things I want you to take away, if you can, is to understand that shame is a verb. It is not a still life. It is not a black blob that sits on top of a part. It is an action that goes on internally. You don't have shame inside without shaming. You gotta have both. One, not one or the other. I'd love for you to continue to build the muscle that allows you to name it and work with it in couple therapy. And to understand your couple's relational dilemmas, what happens as a result of this shame and shaming parts. And to build confidence to help couples move from I am to it happened. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But, you know, I am bad, move from I am bad to something bad happened to me. So this is my hope for you in terms of takeaways for today. Okay? So just a little bit about the autonomic nervous system, and I think you asked when I was working with Linda and Susan, what if you say go into your body and they basically say, I don't have a body, you know, which people really do feel like that. Everybody does pretty much have a body, and everybody does have an autonomic nervous system, and that autonomic nervous system is put in place for a really important reason. And it is to help us get out of danger and help us to move away from life-threatening experiences. And I just want to read something about shame in the autonomic nervous system. A couple things. So I really like this, and actually I don't even know where I got it, and it's not written here, but the activation of the autonomic nervous system is part of the brain's overall crisis response, right? The fact that the autonomic nervous system is activated by shame, so we know that the body goes into a reaction during shaming and shamed, suggests that the brain interprets shame as a crisis of some sort. The most likely crisis signaled by shame is a threat to relational bonds, right? So, and all the highly valued resources they contain. So I just want to say that threat in relationship, shame is a huge threat in relationship, shame and shaming. And it can cause the autonomic nervous system to go into their response, which is fight or flight, or shut down and numb and freeze, right? And if we pay attention to how we see that in IFS, we could name those as particular protective parts that go into action, they deploy when there's a huge threat to the relationship during shame or shaming. Does that make sense? Okay. And just another thing, because shame involves the total self, it's a global experience. It's deeply embodied. One blushes, sweats, has a quickened heart rate, yet despite the arousal, one feels bodily frozen, paralyzed, exposed, and unable to escape or hide. The intensity of the autonomic arousal paired with the inability to hide from it, be from oneself or others, makes the experience of shame feel primitive and irrational. Does that make sense to you? If you think about the times that you have been, you're both heightened and and damped down. So it's a really scary experience. These are my beliefs. Again, you might not agree with this, so that's great. If you don't, that's fine. But I do believe that shame is an emotion like any other. And it's universal. And I want to do just a little experiment with you for a second. So Those of you that have ever felt shamed or humiliated, would you stand up? So look around. Everyone in this room has had that experience, right? Now, only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated yourself. Only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated yourself. And look around. And now, only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated another person. And look around. So, the message here is we are all in this together. No one has never had these experiences of internal or external shaming, okay? Now you may sit down. Shamed and shaming is repairable, but it becomes toxic when it isn't. And I also want to make a caveat for all the parents in the room, because as we talk about what happens to children, you could easily go to shaming yourself, or me, perhaps, which is okay. I'd rather have you do that than do it to yourself. But this is not about parent blaming. There's no child in the whole world that gets out of having the shame and shaming experience. So, as much as we would like to think that we could, so just hold on to those parts. You know, just make a place inside yourself to you know, hold tight if any of your parts, your parenting parts, start to, you know, get activated, and then you feel like you need to shame yourself. You know, the problem with shame becoming toxic, and this is what we see when we start working with couples, is the unrepaired shaming that occurs in early relationships. So shame involves a global negative assessment of one's worth. I did wrong, therefore I am bad. And ultimately the dilemma becomes, because I'm bad, I'm alone. So as Helen Block Lewis is saying, this becomes extremely primitive in our internal systems, is you know, if I'm bad and I can't figure out how to get good, this is going to be very dangerous for me, isn't it? Because good keeps you alive and bad gets you exiled. When exiles finally get a voice, we are finally beginning to listen to them. They say things like this: I'm worthless or unlovable. I'm bad. What else do they say? What are the shame statements you start to hear when you are listening to your own exiles, or you're listening to your clients' exiles? What do you hear? I don't deserve. Say it again. Helpless? Yeah. Not good enough. Failure. Alone. Okay. And how do they know this? They were told. Who told them? Someone else. And then what happened? So this becomes the question that we're asking in therapy, which is, how does a bad thing happen become I am bad? And from an IFS perspective, we would say that parts believe the story, fiction becomes reality. Every child is misattuned to. You don't get out of life without having that experience. In IFS, we use the parts language, and parts develop strategies to try to regulate the shame. Right? You with me there? These strategies produce more shame. I'm going to name tons. And you're going to see tons. Because remember the Mike Elkinism, for those of you that know Mike Elkin, protectors get exactly what they're hoping to avoid. Again, shame is not a thing. This is the biggest takeaway I want you to take away. It's not a thing. It's an action. And here is one scenario. This is not the only way that children get shamed and develop shamers, okay? But I just want you to take a peek at these slides. So, does that child look like he's being shamed? Okay. So very quickly, research shows that he now learns how to do that to himself as a way to protect himself. So this is what it means, that a shame protector does not unburden shame. A shaming protector internally does not prevent shame from keeping on rolling in the system. But that's what this part thinks. When we talk to firefighters and we talk to managers, why are they afraid to stop their shaming?
It's a route.
You'll feel the shame. I'm going to get to you before anybody else does. And it becomes a moral dilemma internally. You know how to live with this much shame, so I'm going to keep you here. Because if I step back, the world is going to get you. Does that make sense? So when you start working with people with shame, one of the things that you'll hear from the protectors over and over and over again is, I can live with what I've got now. I couldn't live with any more. You know that one, right? Okay. But then also what happens is you are more likely then in your relationship to do to your partner what you do to yourself. Second biggest takeaway that I want you to have, that I want you to take away, is that there is no way that you do it to yourself and you don't do it to someone else or vice versa. And that these shame protectors' job is to make you think that you don't. Right? And here's how Martha and I describe it, that a lot of shame protectors are like vipers. You know what vipers are? They come out, they strike, and they curl back. They can leave the scene without you ever even seeing them, whoosh, like that. And that's what some of those shame protectors are like. And I would say if my husband was in the audience, he'd be rigorously nodding, because I have shame about the shame protector, one of my shame protectors, that strikes out at him. So when he is hurt or confronts that behavior, I say, that wasn't that bad. Can anybody relate? You're so sensitive, that wasn't that bad. And he's like, yeah, the teeth marks are still in my arm. So, it's a really big invitation to take hold it lightly and just do a little bit of experimenting with, maybe it's possible that this is true, that what I do to myself, I do to others. So when we start working with couples, when I sit down with a couple and I'm interviewing them, I am listening all the time for this language. I'm not enough, I'm too much, I can't be myself. That's the language of shame in relationship. I'm going to say a tiny bit about shame versus guilt. There is all kinds of research on this. So, but what I want you to take from this is that what I believe is shame is about me. Shame is about me. Guilt is about you. So if I'm feeling guilty, I'm not going to cut myself off from making a repair with you. If I am, totally in shame, I'm probably going to make you the problem, right? So when people say they feel guilty, I always want to hear just a little bit more about that. I feel so guilty, I can't face them. I say to myself, not so much. I want to know if that's really guilt or if it's shame. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so question it. If somebody tells you they're feeling, embarrassed or guilty, find out, what is that? Is that guilt or is that actually shame? Because if you're working with shame, then you have to go down a little bit. And believe it or not, what I believe is that guilt is a step toward healing, that we want to move people from shame to guilt and to guilt and remorse, because that will move people toward repair. One person experiences shaming inside or out. They become self-focused. This is just what we're talking about, because I want out of this feeling. It's intolerable, and I want to get out as fast as I can. And I do all kinds of things, including rage or blame you. I put myself on a little program of watching when I was feeling bad, watching how quickly I wanted to find somebody to blame. I encourage you to do it, because it was amazing. I walk into my barn and things are out of order and I can't get things done as fast as I want to, and I'm going to be late for this or that, and I want to find who did this to my barn. Who can I find to make responsible for my bad feeling? And, it's a interesting experiment, especially if you're living with an intimate other, because they're usually the one that is triggering a deep, vulnerable feeling, and then they're a great target for your protectors. When you want to blame someone else, just take a breath and see if you can listen to what's going on deeper. Just a little experiment. The minute you want to criticize somebody, judge somebody, or maybe even shame somebody, see if you can quickly do a U-turn and find out, what are you really feeling about yourself first, okay? And prone to disconnect, and I think that's what we mean by a-relational, because shame is all about relationship. It happens in relationship, it heals in relationship, but when we're in this cycle, we are prone to pull out. And we are apt to become relationally dangerous, actually. The very thing that we do to take care of ourselves when we're feeling shame, when we're unconscious, can be very dangerous to another person. Common shame protectors, and you'll probably come up with many of your own: anger, blame, and grandiosity in a relationship is often coupled with withdrawal over responsibility and avoidance. Perfectionism is another shame protector. Chronic criticism, fantasy, overdoing of any kind, firefighting of any kind can often be a shame protector. Caretaking and rescuing can also be a shame protector, and as I said, can be really harmful. And the belief of a protective part that shame only equals more shame. No point in going to shame, because it's only going to bring more shame upon us. I'm going to make a generalization that this is so very true in the world of men. You can validate me or not, that being vulnerable, not acceptable. So I know how to deal with the closed off experience that I have. And I know how to deal, I learned very young how to deal with, feeling shamed, get a PhD. I'm not going to open that up. No, there's no point in going there. And, if we had lots more time, we could unpack this whole, gender difference also. But Brene, I got to give a real shout out to Brene Brown. She has really brought this to the masses, and this idea of the difference between men and women and what women do to men, quite frankly. So, and when you're working with heterosexual couples, it's something to remember. IFS is such an incredible process for working with shame, because we're going to work with the shamers and the shamed. And we're not going to hold that either one of those is more important than any other. Right? So a self-compassionate stance is what makes deep healing possible. The compassion of self-energy is inherently shame-regulating. And, there's a Buddhist psychologist, Kristen Neff, who's doing all kinds of research on the power of compassion, psychological healing. And then, so we say, if self-compassion is the antidote, then IFS has the answer, right? Because what we're doing is asking people to unblend from the shamed and shaming parts and learn to love those parts of yourself. Learn to love those parts of yourself. So it holds a significant key, we say here, because the other key is being able to be in relationship with your vulnerability. So, and you know, you can see that it's the journey of couples, and it's a painful place that they can't get to because of shame, is being able to bring all of who they are to their partner and still feel loved and accepted and known. So that is, you know, we talk about the journey. That is the journey. So it's not just inner healing, it's outer healing as well. I just want to say something about us and you. And I think it takes a lot of courage to be able to start, for some of us, to begin to start naming it and saying the word shame. We're shame-phobic in our community. I really believe that. And that it's very scary for some of our parts to name that what we're hearing and seeing is shamed and shaming. We have parts that believe if we start naming this, what's going to happen? We'll be shaming. And that's the very thing that your clients' protectors say to themselves. And this is one of Helen Block Lewis's contributions too, is her talking about how if we don't name it, it becomes way worse for the client because they'll turn on themselves. So, you know, how important it is, it's because if you bring it up and your client gets triggered, you can work it out relationally. So we want to bring shame into conscious awareness because a lot of people, like me, when I was confronted, I didn't know that my part was so hurtful, this part of me. So making it safe to bring shame and shaming into conscious awareness and being able to help people differentiate between these disowned parts. You know, in other language, it might be working with a shadow, really working with those parts that live in the shadow and that we want to deny, avoid, pretend don't exist. And of course, self-compassion, which leads to self-forgiveness, which leads to internal security, which leads to affect regulation. The last thing that I want to invite to you is the countertransference around shame. Countertransference around shame, that you will have parts of you in your unconscious that will want to block the process of healing shame. And a big one are the rescuers and caretakers. I notice another thing, which is anxious parts that want to kind of hurry up the process. Let's get you out of pain really quickly. So maybe in your practice groups this afternoon, but for sure in your offices, I would encourage you to start paying attention to where you might be hearing little messages of shame coming up and your impulse to try to get it to go back down. You can only take your clients where you're willing to go yourself, right? So go there.
This podcast episode is brought to you by Helix Sleep. Sleep is super important to me. In the last few years, I've come to conclude it is the end-all, be-all, that all good things, good mood, good performance, good everything seem to stem from good sleep. So I've tried a lot to optimize it. I've tried pills and potions, all sorts of different mattresses, you name it. And for the last few years, I've been sleeping on a Helix Midnight Luxe mattress. I also have one in the guest bedroom. And you get not cheap pillows either. That's Helix multivitamins, multi-mistake. Just but it really goes far beyond any type of trauma. So it applies to, I would say, each and every one of us. It will help you work with your inner critic. It will help you to befriend inner voices, not in the pathological sense. And at one point in this episode, I do a live demo as the patient with Richard of IFS. So that is a real life, real subject matter demo. And be patient. This is a dense episode at points, and you may find yourself wondering, what the hell are these two talking about? Be patient. Just sit with it for a minute or two, and it'll get back to terra firma, and you will have your bearings. And you can think of IFS also, which has been very helpful to me personally. And I've seen some incredible, I would say almost miraculous before and afters in video of therapeutic sessions. Can be compared to perhaps GTD, Getting Things Done. So Getting Things Done by David Allen, incredible system. David's been on the podcast, is excellent for getting rid of all the stuff, right? The work, death by 1,000 paper cuts and open loops and things floating around in different systems, things that aren't captured, getting all that stuff, which a lot of people would think of in a work capacity, into some kind of flow and system so you can work with it and give yourself some peace of mind. Imagine if you could do that, if you had a system for doing that for your emotions, for the flare-ups of energy, of anger, of sadness, of self-flagellation, if you had some kind of system that allowed you to contend with all of that stuff. IFS is one such system. And also, this episode is the first time that I talk openly, and I did not plan on this, about everything that has happened since I published my episode on childhood abuse. So there you have the preface to the intro, and now to the intro. But before I get there, I can't help but read one quote which applies to all of this episode. It's a quote from Jack Kornfield. If your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. And with that, to the intro we go. Hello, boys and girls. This is Tim Ferriss, and welcome to another episode of The Tim Ferriss Show. My guest today, I've wanted to have on for years now, Richard Schwartz. He began his career as a family therapist and an academic at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is now on the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. But it was at the University of Illinois at Chicago where he discovered that family therapy alone did not achieve full symptom relief. And in asking patients why, he learned that they were plagued by what they called parts. And we'll get into what that means. These patients became his teachers as they described how their parts formed networks of interrelationships that resembled the families he had been working with. He also found that as they focused on and thereby separated from their parts, they could shift into a state characterized by qualities like curiosity, calm, confidence, and compassion. He called that inner essence the self and was amazed to find it even in severely diagnosed and traumatized patients. From these explorations, the internal family systems, otherwise known as IFS, model was born in the early 1980s. IFS is now evidence-based and has become a widely used form of psychotherapy, particularly with trauma. It provides a non-pathologizing, optimistic, and empowering perspective and a practical and effective set of techniques for working with individuals, couples, families, and more recently, corporations and classrooms. And I want to add just a little bit more context, which Richard may or may not disabuse me of. But one way to think about this is as a toolkit for reconciling parts of yourself that may have conflict amongst them or difficulties amongst them, parts of yourself that you've disavowed, and therefore it is not limited to heavily traumatized patients in a psychotherapeutic context. So what we're going to be talking about in this episode, I think, applies to just about everyone. I'm going to hedge by not saying everyone, although if I'm being honest, think everyone in many, many, many different contexts. So with all of that preamble said, Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. I'm honored by those words and also just so excited to be with you. I've been a fan, and particularly a fan of the session you did several ago where you were so disclosive about your own history. Just thought that was amazingly courageous and a service to everybody.
Appreciate you saying that. And it's been one hell of a journey, both since the podcast and leading up to it.
I was wondering what it's been like and what kind of feedback you've gotten.
Well, let's talk about it. I haven't spoken publicly about the after effects or the consequences, positive and unintended. I will say that for those people who don't know what we're referring to, I put out an episode of this podcast in September. You can find it at tim.blog/trauma, which disclosed history of sexual abuse. So suffering at the hands of an abuser from ages 2 to 4. at a babysitter's house and talked about my healing journey. Subsequent to that, my ups and downs, my battles with depression and all sorts of other things in conversation with a close friend of mine, Debbie Millman, who also is a survivor of sexual abuse, although we both take some issue with that word survivor. But nonetheless, putting that aside, that was the episode. And I expected, since it was in some respects many years in the making, I anticipated putting it into book form after my parents passed away. So it was always inside my head 15 or 20 years in the future, something I would do. And as soon as it was published, my response to it on some level was that of feeling like I was in a surreal alternate reality, because it was now current tense, or in some sense past tense, right? I published this thing that I thought wasn't going to ever see the light of day or be shared with the public for 15 to 20 years. And it was bizarre. I had girded myself for a tsunami of emotions and difficulty and maybe attacks and so on. I set rules with my team and policies so that I could stay entirely off of social media. We turned off comments on certain types of posts, really to stem the flow. And the first 2 days, I'd cleared my entire calendar for that week to have space. The first 2 days were very tranquil. And I don't know if that's because I was genuinely at peace, if there was some type of shock. I couldn't tell you. I don't claim to have that level of self-awareness, but it was very, very calm. And then having so much space for the rest of the week was very challenging. I typically run pretty hot in the sense that I like traveling in 6th gear and doing a lot. So having that much time to ruminate or to experience consciousness uncluttered by activity, in retrospect, maybe was a little harder on me than filling my calendar, if you can imagine that.
Yeah.
I remember having Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on the podcast, and he said, to avoid depression after certain points, he just made his calendar very busy, and he said he would recommend it to anyone. And I did the opposite, and it was very challenging. So I had a lot of, just as an example, and I haven't spoken to anybody publicly, but here we are, and I'm pretty well caffeinated, so I'll try to cut short my my monologue here in a second. But I had a lot of anger and rage come up, but the way in which it came up was very surprising to me. I had this flood. I remember it was on the Wednesday after this podcast came out on Monday. This flood of memories of past slights, many of them really trivial. It just like emails I didn't like, or rejections that hurt my feelings, or fill in the blank. And I was so pissed off all day on Wednesday, and I didn't try to fix it. I didn't worry about it, but I thought it was really quite surprising that this anger was coming to the surface, but it wasn't specific to any of the abuse. It was in just dozens of kind of trite or inconsequential slights from my past. And I was just pissed off all day long. And then when the podcast really hit escape velocity, in the sense that it was widely shared enough that a lot of my friends had heard it, that's when things got a little harder, because I would say of my very close male friends, and I don't have that many close friends by design, let's just arbitrarily say 20. I would say 7 or 8 of them reached out to me to confess that they had been sexually abused and never told anyone.
Wow.
And some of them sent me voice memos, really kind of tear-jerking, heart-shredding audio. And I mean, just thinking about it, I'm like welling up with tears a bit, because it was fucking emotionally difficult for them, and also very challenging for me to act as a sort of recipient or support. And I'm glad they reached out. I'm really glad they reached out. I expected there would be a lot of this. So we received tons of emails, tons of blog comments, tons of handwritten letters from people describing their experiences. But that was really very difficult. And to wrap up, since this is interview intended to ask you questions,
Right.
I'm very, very, very proud of it. And I'm not proud often. That's something I have always had difficulty with. I don't accept praise well or let it land well. I'm really proud of it, and it did a lot of good. And it was tough, but not in the ways that I had anticipated.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you can be proud of it, because I agree. I think it really served us to have someone of your stature be that open about it, and yeah, and live to see the light of day, like you said.
Let's talk more about living to see the light of day, because you have worked in many places with many people, and some of those people perhaps have resigned to a life of darkness or a life that is shadowed by certain experiences, trauma, depression, suicidal ideation, etc. Could you, and I don't know if this name is going to ring a bell because I'm not sure if you anonymized it or somebody else did, but there's a great piece in Medium, Inside the Revolutionary Treatment, that could change psychotherapy forever. And in it, I read about the story of Roxanne
Uh-huh.
and how that was part of developing IFS. Could you share that story, please?
This was in the early 1980s, and I was a fresh graduate of a PhD program in marital and family therapy, and I was trying to prove that family therapy was the thing, was found the Holy Grail. And so I did an outcome study with a bunch of bulimic clients, which was a syndrome that was new on the scene at the time. And she was one of them. And as I was trying to do this family therapy with all these clients, and succeeded in actually reorganizing the families the way the book said to, they kept binging and purging. They didn't realize they'd been cured. And so out of frustration, I began asking why, and they started talking this language of parts, which was sort of bizarre to me. I thought maybe they were sicker than I thought, because they were talking about these, what they called parts of them that could take over and make them do things they didn't want to do, and had a lot of autonomy inside. And they were talking about them as if they were sort of full range personalities. And so after I got over my fear about it, I got curious, and I started to try and get my clients to relate differently. So they would say something like, something bad happens in my life, and this critic attacks me inside, calls me all kinds of brutal names. And that brings up another part of me that feels totally worthless and alone and empty and desperate. And that feeling is so dreadful that to the rescue comes the binge to take me away from all that. But that brings back the critic. So I'm hearing about these interactions among different seeming to be entities inside of them. And as a family therapist, that was intriguing, because that's what I studied, these interactions among family members. And I began to explore trying to change some of this. But I was assuming that these parts were what they seem to be, which is what the field sort of still assumes, that the critic is just a critical parental voice that they internalized, and the binge is an out-of-control impulse. And so from that frame of understanding it, you're limited what you can have your clients do. So I was getting my clients to stand up to the critic and don't take it and control the binge. And they were getting worse, but I didn't know what else to do. When I was like the man in a hole with a shovel, you just dig deeper. So until this client, who, in addition to being eating disordered, also cut herself on her wrists, and I knew had a bit of a sex abuse history. I didn't know the extent of it. And so I began to try and work with that cutting part in the way I had with these others. And so I would get her to have a dialogue with it in which she would try to tell it couldn't do this to her anymore. That was done, no more of this. And I was sort of saying that to the part too. And after a couple hours of badgering it that way, it finally, in her head, agreed to not cut her that week. And then I opened the door to the next session, and she has a big gash down the side of her face. And I just collapsed emotionally inside when I saw that. And I spontaneously said, I give up. I can't beat you at this. And she said, the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was a turning point, because I shifted out of that controlling, coercive place to just being curious. And I said, so why do you do this to her? And I had her ask that. And the part said, sort of told the story of how when she was being sexually abused, it had to get her out of her body and contain the rage that would get her more abuse. And I shifted again. Now I don't see it as just, you know, I had appreciation for it, but it was like a hero in her life. It really saved her during those abuse scenes. And as I listened to it more, it sounded like it was still living back in that time, like it still thought she was 5 years old, and it still had to protect her in this way. And that it carried these extreme beliefs and emotions that we call burdens about the world, about her, about how dangerous everything was, that drove it. These extreme beliefs and emotions were like a virus, it seemed, that, like the coronavirus, that drove the way it operated. And so as I got all that, I started to think, maybe these parts aren't what they seem. Maybe they are like kids in a family, a dysfunctional family, where they're forced out of their naturally valuable states to be in roles to protect the family, or because of the dynamics of the family that aren't who they are and don't serve them, but they think are necessary. And in exploring that, it turns out that's true. That, first of all, we all have these things I'm calling parts, that they called parts, that, from my point of view, aren't the product of trauma, which has been the way it's been viewed, you know, multiple personality disorders. The unitary brain got shattered by the trauma. Well, for me, it's the natural state of the mind to be multiple, to have these parts, and they're all valuable. We wouldn't be born with anything that wasn't valuable, and they come into our life from birth with us. And then trauma and attachment injuries and things like that force them out of their naturally valuable states into roles that they don't like, but they think are absolutely necessary to keep us safe, and then can become symptoms and problems. But they also, if they are listened to and actually loved ultimately by our clients and ourselves, will transform. So anyway, I got rolling on this, but
well, that's why we have a long form podcast.
right.
You can get rolling. And I just want to say, for people who are trying to envision what this might look like, and you and I will attempt to do a live demo of this using me as a guinea pig a bit later in this conversation. But I recall the first time that I saw IFS in action. And I will say that and I'm sure you've heard this before, but the internal family systems brand name, so to speak, initially led me to have a bit of a knee-jerk aversion, because I assumed that I would have to, I took it very literally. I assumed, although I didn't read the internal, I wasn't quite sure what that referred to, that I would have to sit down with my mom and my dad and my brother and do family therapy of some type. And I was like, I'm out. I don't want to do it.
Right.
But when I saw IFS in action for the first time, it was when I was going through the MAPS MDMA assisted psychotherapy training program as an auditor. I'm not in any way licensed as a psychotherapist or psychologist or otherwise, but as an auditor, I wanted to experience the program and was able to see session footage of people with severe PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, in many cases vets, who certainly with the amplification and assistance of MDMA, but nonetheless, in this particular case, under the care of Michael and Annie Mithofer, going through IFS to see where someone could start with their, say, relationship or thoughts perspective on rage and where they would end up was truly mind-blowing. I mean, to watch it in video form was so impactful. And I want to highlight one aspect of that really struck a chord with me on a whole lot of levels. And I'm going to do this by referring back to this Medium piece. And I'll link to this Medium piece in the show notes for people at tim.blog/podcast if you want to read this as well. But I'm going to read a paragraph and then I'm going to dive into one particular aspect of it. So here we go. Frank Anderson, a former clinical instructor at Harvard Medical School, was working as a staff psychiatrist at Bessel van der Kolk's renowned trauma center in Brookline, Massachusetts, when he first encountered Schwartz and IFS. For people who don't know the name Bessel van der Kolk, he's the author of a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a bit of a classic in this world. All right, so back to Frank Anderson. First encountered Schwartz and IFS, it flipped his world upside down. Quote, I had been working with severe trauma for a long time at the trauma center, and I was one of the many people who go, oh, wow, Anderson recalls. Within the mental health world, it's a huge paradigm shift. IFS is very non-pathologizing. Every part, every symptom has a positive intention. That kind of blows therapists away. What do you mean shooting heroin has a positive intention? What do you mean cutting yourself or binging has a positive intention? End quote. So the non-pathologizing nature of IFS is what I want to hone in on, because you very often hear, and this is speaking as a layperson, if you start kind of wading through the books and literature and even in-person conversations in psychiatry, you very often hear the term maladaptive, right? This behavior is maladaptive. What this person's doing is maladaptive, meaning it's some kind of like perversion of an adaptation that doesn't fit. At least the way that I hear it. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding and the way that I've been able to finally find some compassion for myself and parts of myself is to recognize that the things that we view in ourselves as totally fucked up, totally self-destructive, totally fill in the blank pejorative term, very often are not maladaptive. They are perfectly adaptive. They've just outlived their usefulness, or they've kind of expired, but they still remain, if that makes any sense. And so the non-pathologizing and any piece of what I just said, I'd love to hear you respond to.
Well, you said it really well. And that it's been a tough sell in my field, but that is what I found back with that client and subsequently with thousands of clients, not just myself, but all the people using this around the world are finding that these things we thought were symptoms are maladaptive in the sense that in our current context, they may not be needed, but they were definitely needed. They were like heroes, like I was saying, back when we were being hurt, and they get stuck back there. So again, I'm a family therapist, so I'm trying to understand the context of all kinds of both external people's behavior and internal. And the internal parts behavior made total sense back when you were being hurt. And they think they still need to do it because they think you're still in the same kind of vulnerability. So, yeah. So it has been a tough sell.
Just a quick thanks to one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. The new year is here, and it marks a fresh start for your small business. Whether you're shifting business hours or hiring more remote employees, one thing that remains unchanged is the importance of having the right people on your team. When your business is ready to make that next hire, LinkedIn Jobs can help by matching your role with qualified candidates so you can find the right person quickly. And to lend a helping hand, your first job post is free. Getting started is easier than ever with new features to help you find qualified candidates quickly from LinkedIn's active community of professionals with more than 722 million members worldwide. Post a job with targeted screening questions to get your role in front of more qualified candidates. You can manage job posts and contact candidates on the familiar LinkedIn.com website, where functions are streamlined into one simple screen. And now you can do all of this from your mobile device, no matter where the day takes you. When your business is ready to make that next hire, find the right person with LinkedIn Jobs. And now you can post a job for free. Just visit linkedin.com/Tim. Again, that's linkedin.com/Tim to post a job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. I would say that many of the most important and impactful inputs that I've had in the last handful of years from a healing perspective, and furthermore, not just from a healing perspective, getting back to whole, but even just becoming a, hopefully, I know this is a really generic term, like better human. So not just getting to baseline, but actually going beyond baseline in some ways, has related to self-compassion.
Hmm.
And radical acceptance by Tara Brach would be a very, in some respects, Buddhist mindfulness approach to that. And I feel like IFS is a very tactical, practical framework for actually kind of getting after it, almost in a tennis match type of way. I mean, not that it's adversarial, but with the assistance of someone else. And I'd love to explore what some of these parts are, and to explore, for instance, protectors and some of these other labels, just to give people an understanding of what this looks like in practice. What do you think the best way to do that is? Is it giving a conceptual overview of some type? Is it just getting into it and you and I rolling up the sleeves and seeing what happens?
If I gave a brief conceptual overview, then what we do with each other would make more sense to people. So let me
Great.
do
Let's do it.
that. So as I was exploring this with clients back in the day, I'm a systems person. I'm looking for distinctions and patterns. And the big distinction that leaped out immediately as I was doing it with more and more clients was between parts that were very young, and the culture has been called these wonderful inner children who were vulnerable and sensitive, and often were the parts of us that are the most hurt by the traumas. They take it the most personally, and they get the most frightened and they feel the most worthless often. And once those young, formerly happy-go-lucky, delightful, creative inner parts of us, once they get hurt that way, they have the power to overwhelm us and give us all the burdened emotions that they carry. So, not knowing we're locking up our most juicy parts, we tend to try and get away from them and put them in inner basements or abysses or caves. So I call them the exiles. And we've all done that to one degree or another, even if you haven't had a lot of trauma. There are ways our culture or your family didn't accept certain parts of you, and so you had to move away from them. And we do it not realizing, we think we're just moving away from dreadful memories or sensations or emotions, but we are locking up these parts of us that are so wonderful and have so many talents when they're not locked up and when they're not stuck in the past. So when you have a lot of exiles, then the world becomes a lot more dangerous and you feel a lot more delicate. So other parts have to jump into other protective roles, some of which are designed to control the world so your exiles don't get triggered. Because if they get triggered, then it's like flames of emotion threaten to consume you. And these protectors often think you're going to die if you stay with that. So there are parts that'll keep you a certain distance from people. There are parts that'll control your appearance so you don't get rejected, parts that try to make your performance perfect so you get a lot of accolades to counter the worthlessness. So all of that we call protect, those are manager protectors because they're managing a lot. They're like what in family therapy we used to call parentified inner children. In a family where the parents abdicate, the kids have to become the parents. They were called parental children. This happens inside of us too. These younger parts have to kind of run our lives, and they get extreme because they're in over their heads. Often they become these critics. They're yelling at us just to try and get us to behave. They don't know what else to do than to yell at us. And so those are some of the common manager roles. Others are these massive caretaking parts that don't let us take care of ourselves, only take care of everybody else. There's just a lot of common manager roles. When that doesn't work and the world breaks through those quote unquote defenses and triggers our exiles, it's a big emergency. And so there's another set of parts who's on call almost, who immediately goes into action to take us out, to get us higher than the flames of emotion, or to douse them with some substance or to distract us until they burn themselves out. So those we call firefighters, because they're fighting the fire of this exiled emotion inside of you. And we all have some of those, and most of us have a kind of hierarchy of them. If the first one doesn't work, we go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. And the top of the hierarchy is often suicide. It's a big kind of comfort to many people to know if things get bad enough, there's always that safety net. I can exit strategy. But other kinds of firefighter activities include a lot of addictions. And for me, it sounds like for you too, it's work is one of mine. Firefighter activities, eating was one of mine. It's not anymore. So, those are some of the common firefighters. So most all of us walk around with some version of that system. The more trauma you experienced, the more exiles you have, then the more extreme your parts often are. In addition to all of that, though, and this is actually the big discovery in IFS, as I was doing this work, and I would, as a family therapist, try to have dialogues inside among these different parts like I would in a family, often I'd have to get one part to kind of separate or move back or step out for a second so I could have two others talk to each other because the other was interfering. And as I started doing that process of getting parts to open more space inside and not, be chattering all the time, slowed it down, it was like another person would pop out who took the lead and was just immediately curious about these parts, or even had a lot of compassion suddenly out of the blue, and also was calm and was confident. And the parts would relate well to this person. And when I asked what part of you is that, clients would say some version of, that's not a part like these others, that's myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And it turns out, and this is really totally amazing, but given all the 40 years we've been doing this and the thousands of people doing it around the world, I can safely say that self, capital S, is in everybody, can't be damaged, and knows how to heal, and can be accessed simply by getting these parts to open space, because it seems it's just beneath the surface of them. So when I'm working with somebody, I will wait until I hear some of those C words. In addition to the four I mentioned, there's also courage, clarity, creativity, and connectedness. So I'm waiting to hear when my client is in that place before I have them work with their parts. And when they work with their parts from that place, they just naturally know how to heal.
So if I may just reflect on what you said for a second, I mean, this is for people who have never had a psychedelic experience. If we look at the etymology of psychedelic, I mean, it is mind manifesting in a sense, if we want to roughly translate it to English. And it's incredible how much your description of working with IFS parts and then this self, right? This sort of a central observer who has, as maybe as Stan Groff would put it, an innate healing intelligence or something like that. How much it mirrors what some people can only achieve with drugs, meaning psychedelic drugs or plants or fungi of some type, right? It's pretty remarkable that you're able to sort of engineer and back into, without any type of pharmaceutical intervention, something very, very similar and get to a very similar place.
Let me comment on that for a second. So,
Sure.
because you mentioned Michael and Annie Mithofer, and in phase one, when Michael was using MDMA with these mostly combat vets, but PTSD clients, and he started talking excitedly about this because they're both well-trained IFS therapists, I started to feel more and more validated, because for some reason the MDMA seems to get all your protectors to relax. And so you, just by virtue of having taken the medicine, you're in self with those C words that I described earlier.
Right.
And he found, and he kept track of this, he tracked that phase 1 group, and he found that over 70% spontaneously started doing IFS without any coaching from him, because in the protocol they set it up where they couldn't lead the client. It was all kind of, following.
Yeah,
So
non-directional, right?
exactly. So that confirmed to me that I had just stumbled onto a process that people naturally know how to do when they access enough self, and they'll do it on their own. And that's true too. It's become a kind of life practice where people do this on a daily basis often.
So how can we demonstrate this for folks? And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little nervous about sort of opening the kimono on the podcast, but it seems to be I seem to be setting a trend in doing that with recent episodes. So I might as well just go for it, and for a penny and for a pound. So what's a good way for you and I to have a chat to try to illustrate some of these things?
Well, if there is a part of you you'd like to get to know better, or change your relationship with, or if there's something still getting in your way from, you mentioned that there was a very angry part of you that came up and had all these, what in retrospect seemed like minor quibbles, but we could go there. It's really up to you, whatever you want to explore.
Well, I would say when I've looked at the anger and tried to work with it, and it's quite subdued, not exiled or not disavowed, but it's not as high volume as it used to be even a few years ago. But I do think that the anger is very often a byproduct or a symptom of fear. And so the fear, I think, could be worth digging into. And something that I've noticed as I have successfully contended with and healed from depression, that anxiety has become more pronounced, and this sort of vague sense of unease that something bad can and will happen, that type of anxiety that I then create narratives around, because I'll say I'll sort of have this wave of anxiety and then explain it in all sorts of ways that may or may not be accurate. But that has become something that I've noticed more and more as depression has become less and less of an ongoing battle for me in the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
And I'd love to kind of explore that, because I've tried many things to move from a place of anxiety and fear to a place of trust and faith, and goddamn, is it hard. Maybe I'm just exposed to too many ugly aspects of the world where I get to see really bad behavior and sort of Lord of the Flies type dynamics quite a bit. But that is something I wouldn't mind digging into, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Happy to help you with that. And that trust in the world is safe is tough to get through willpower. So we'll try it this other way. So are you ready?